Hi, Sandy here. If you play Legends Arceus, you're likely aware of how the Pokédex works in that game. If not, I'll briefly explain. The Pokédex in Legends Arceus is different in the case of there being research tasks. These tasks usually consist of stuff such as catching a certain amount, or defeating them with a certain type of move like water or grass type moves. Now my goal is to perfect the Pokédex as much as possible before each noble Pokemon. Now not every single task is possible, however, and there will be some minor exemptions and I'll clarify those when they're relevant. And what I mean by them not being possible, I mean they're not possible to complete at the time that Pokemon is captured or stuff like that. This is basically a Professor Oak challenge taken up a notch. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically just catching every Pokemon possible before each gym badge in a game. Or in this case, each Noble. So, let's get into it. Now, I won't be covering every single Pokemon, obviously, and instead I'll just talk about some of the more specific entries, as the early game Pokemon like Shinx, Bidoof, and Starly are all really straightforward and not all that interesting at all. So, let's start with our starter, Cyndaquil. Currently, this is an impossible Pokemon to perfect, since we need to catch 5 for its entry, however this doesn't mean we're just going to completely ignore it. We can still use all the moves required for each evolution stage, so we can get those entries out of the way before the post-game, where it will be possible to perfect it. It's also best to align these Fire-type moves against Pokemon that we need to defeat with that type, such as Wormadam or Cascum. We can also combine the required strong and agile style moves with each required move in order to make progress on those entries as well. And theoretically, this entry is possible via trading. However, this is a good time to mention that I'm on the 1.0 version of the game at the moment, using a physical copy and all that for other reasons that aren't really relevant. But basically, I won't be able to trade at the moment, so that's out of the question. For now, let's move on to the big point of this, the evolutions. Now, you might think, oh, these are the exemptions he was talking about before. There's no way he's grinding all the Evo stones out. Yeah, I will be doing all the evolutions completely, except for one, and we'll get to that in a sec. For Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon, we need 5 evolution stones for each, which sounds really insane early on. However, this is something that can be done in the background while we work on a bunch of other entries. We can get Fire Stones from the red ore nodes, Water Stones from the blue ore nodes, and Thunder Stones from the black ones. This can be done anywhere all over the Obsidian Fieldlands. I believe in later areas the stones differ, but that's not really relevant at all. But it's also safe to say we're not really going to need to grind out any of these 3 evolution stones again. For Sylveon, Umbreon, and Espeon, we need to get the friendship up and then evolve them. Umbreon requires it to be nighttime, which we can sleep to pass to. And Espeon, same thing, except in the daytime. And Sylveon can be done at any time as long as the Eevee knows a fairy-type move when it evolves. Now, there are 2 little complicated ones. Leafeon is easy enough since there's actually a mossy rock in the Heartwoods, which you can just stand next to and evolve a bunch of Eevee. Glaceon, however, is impossible to obtain unless we use merit points, which we're not going to do, at least not for all of the 5 that we need. Since this one can be completely insane on the amount of time required to do it and perfect it, I'm just going to hard limit myself to obtaining 1 Glaceon via these merit points, and I'll perfect it later on down the line. Now, all evolutions actually have the same task. You need to catch 5 of them, 40 of their signature move, 15 Baby Doll Eyes, and 70 Agile moves. Now, the thing that really gets most people is the 70 Agile moves. However, by just teaching them Calm Mind, Baby Doll Eyes, and Focus Energy, then using Mastery Seeds from Alphas to make sure they can use the strong and agile versions of those moves, we can head over to a bunch of Magikarp, which we can reach by jumping down the Obsidian Falls cliffside. There are some trees with Kricketot and some potential Pikachu spawns near it. You basically just drop down the ledge, and you bait over Magikarp with berries, and you just fight them while spamming agile moves and all that. With the combination of moves I had, I was getting up to 25 agile style moves per battle. Now this seems really boring, but I was watching different shows, like I watched the new season of Invincible and caught up on One Piece even during this challenge, so that's to give you an idea of how long this challenge in general is. And for any future entries that require a ton of agile and strong style moves, just assume this is what I did, as it likely is what I did. Now, this next little section I want to talk about is for more of the rare spawns, such as Eevee, Chimchar, Munchlax, Cherubi, the Chansey evolutionary line, and even Quillfish. So let's go over the route I took for all these Pokemon, and it's actually kind of hard to talk about this part since it's hard to explain, so instead I'll just kind of show it on screen. But for Eevee, they have 4 spots that they spawn in, however they're actually more common than you'd think when you start running this route. After that, there's Chimchar, which has 2 spawns aside from the island, and we actually can't reach the island right now, so we have to stick to these 2 spawns at the moment. Munchlax can also be combined in a route with Chimchar, since they're both pretty close to one another. Cherubi is a bit out of the way, but it's best to combine this one with the Chansey route. And basically you just run to the two cherry trees over by the Alpha Lopunny, and then you loop back all the way to the cliffside, the warm-up tunnel, top entrance, and then you can kind of jump up the wall with Wyrdeer. It's a little finicky, but you can get up there eventually. And any of the spawns that have Machop or Machamp typically can also spawn Happiny or Chansey. And the last one is Quillfish, which can also be found here on the map in the water. It's very RNG dependent on completing it. On each run through I was able to get about 2 to 3 encounters with them. And all you really have to do is sprint towards the water, jump before it kicks you off, and then hop off Wyrdeer midair and throw a berry into the range of the Quillfish to lure them closer. After that, it'll teleport you back to land because you're going to drown, and you just throw another berry to pull them even closer. And it's a little tricky, but it works pretty well. I almost forgot to quickly mention these, but we can find a flying Togekiss over near Lake Verity, a flying Staraptor we can catch for its entry requirement over near the Nature's Pantry, and a flying Gyarados near Obsidian Falls. The last thing to mention quickly is we can actually catch the Alpha Magikarp in the previously mentioned location down the cliff by going down the cliffside on the opposite side of the river by the upper entrance to the warm-up tunnel. This helps for both evolving a bunch of Magikarp quickly for Gyarados' entry, and also for the large specimen requirement for Magikarp itself. Next, I want to talk about the really lengthy ones, such as the Alpha exclusives, and what this really entails is Pokemon that can only be battled or caught as Alphas. It's actually a really extensive list consisting of Rapidash, Golbat, Floatzel, Snorlax, Alakazam, Lopunny, Heracross, and Blissey. Now, these only spawn in the Obsidian Fieldlands as alphas, however most of them can also be caught via other means such as evolving their lower evolutions like Golbat and Floatzel, and even so they need to be defeated a certain amount of times, and many can't even be perfected due to some other random task that prevents it. For example, Snorlax needs to be caught while sleeping, alphas can't sleep in the wild so we can't do that one, Heracross needs to leap from trees but it doesn't spawn from trees here in the Fieldlands, and Blissey has an unavailable questline at this moment and it's going to be a while before we can get to that. Now, the others are still really tedious to do, having to defeat 25 Floatzel, but it only has one spawn, and if you think that's bad, you need to knock out 50 Golbat and catch 20. However, I only caught 3 of the alpha spawns, but I still had to KO 50 anyways, so wasn't much of a saving grace there. The reason for catching those 3 alphas, by the way, is because Crobat actually requires 3 alphas to be caught of it, and evolving an alpha still counts for that task. Graveler's another alpha I caught a few of ahead of time, as the same task is required for Golem. Speaking of which, let's get into that. Now, this next bit is a little tricky because while it's possible to obtain the required amount of items that I'll need for these Pokemon I'm going to talk about, it also adds an insane amount of playtime, which wouldn't really amount to much. As you may know, you can pick up statues around the map and receive merit points, which can then be traded for items required to evolve certain Pokemon. Within this section, we would need 5 Metal Coats, 5 Ice Stones, and 20 Linking Cords, which amounts to just about 30,000 merit points. And to put that into perspective, with only the first day unlocked, you get 1 satchel every 1 to 2 hours, if not longer. And that's of playtime, not just real world time, so you're going to need to have your Switch on the entire time. In addition to that, the satchel gives 50 to 100 merit points, with the absolute best RNG possible. If we were to do this, we would still need a minimum of 300 hours of playtime, or 12.5 days of actual playtime, waiting for satchels. That's just waiting for satchels. And that's assuming you're getting one every hour, and that it's worth the 100 merit points. Since that is not worth it to any sane person, instead of that, the plan is this. I'll get one of each Pokemon, the Pokemon being Golem, Machamp, Scizor, and Glaceon. Glaceon being the only one that's technically possible to actually perfect at the moment, so we're going to complete Glaceon's entry in the next area with something else that we unlock. But the other 3 will complete all entries possible at the moment, except for catching all the required amount. That'll be postponed until they're actually able to be perfected. Now, before we wrap up this section, here's some general advice for the challenge. A, don't do it. B, if you're gonna do it, don't. And C. Actually, there's more than just C, but adding more letters would feel weird, so let's just leave it at that. The actual bits of advice are that for any Pokemon that have recoil moves, such as Flare Blitz or Double Edge, go against low-level Pokemon. The recoil is based on the damage done, and if you KO a level 2, you'll take like 10 to 15 damage from it, as opposed to like 50 damage from KOing like a level 17 or something. Additionally, combine any and all tasks as best you can. For example, Geodude rollout against Mothim, Combee, and any other Pokemon that need to be defeated with a Rock-type move. I mentioned this earlier with Cyndaquil. Also, the strong and agile style moves a bit. That's really important to know. It saves you a lot more time than you'd think. And I also recommend that you start with the lowest evolution and carry it around for a while doing other tasks for it, and then level it up, and then if you're going to do the higher evolution next, evolve that one instead of trying to catch the higher evolution in the wild, since by that point the Pokemon you're carrying around is probably already going to be higher level than the average wild one you'd get. And also, don't overestimate Pokemon AI. Aside from Pokemon like Abra and Eevee, which are especially jumpy and alert for some reason, most Pokemon, even alphas, will just kind of stare at you if you run right next to them on Weird Ear or even just on foot, and you can really use this to your advantage to get free backstrikes. Lastly, Hoopa Berries and Leppa Berries are amazing for this. Leppas can be found from trees, while Hoopas also drop from Abras and Kadabras. These are basically just PP boosting moves, so you replenish 10 PP per berry. It's really good to stock up on these. Also, use outbreaks that you can get to your advantage for Pokemon such as Golbat and Rapidash, since you can get those outbreaks, and they'll really save you a ton of time for this. So now, let's wrap this up and go over all the entries we were unable to perfect, starting with Cyndaquil, Quilava, Typhlosion, Cascoon, Ponyta, Eevee, Glaceon, Crobat, Burmy, Wormadam, Golem, Snorlax, Parasect, Raichu, Abra, Infernape, Golduck, Combee, Vespiquen, Scizor, Heracross, Mr. Mime, Gyarados, Shellos, Gastrodon, Blissey, Togekiss, and Machamp. I don't think I repeated any of those, hopefully I didn't, but whatever. This just means that there are 28 Pokemon that we can obtain, but not perfect, before defeating Cleaver. We can get 56 out of the 84 available Pokemon, which is a little more than a fifth of the dex, which makes sense. There are 4 more areas to explore, so that adds up pretty well. So now we can beat Cleaver and head to the next section. Truthfully, I was planning on beating these nobles in like a damageless fight, and while I do still plan to do that, that'll be for another video. Adding that to this video would make it a lot longer and it kind of feel more conflated without any actual substance. So yeah, we're going to be doing that at a different time. Now, after unlocking access to the Crimson Mirelands, we now have a ton of new Pokemon to perfect, along with a new red Pokemon, which we can use to dig up some very important items like Peat Blocks and Sunstones, of which we're going to need 5 of each. Now, another thing we can do is finish some of the older dex entries due to unlocking the Questlands finally, such as Mr. Mime, Ponyta, Cascoon, and Parasect. Now, I want to cover the section by just, well, sectioning the map out. So here's a breakdown of all the sections, starting with the top of the map with the areas between the Brava Arena and the Diamond Settlement, which has some Pokemon that don't spawn anywhere else on the map, or spawn everywhere else inconsistently. The main ones being the Alpha Roserade and Honchkrow, which share a spawn point, and which one spawns depends on the time of day. This is actually the only location to find either Honchkrow or Roserade, so any catching tests or defeating tests need to be completed with this one. Most of this is just being done in passing or by spam leaving and re-entering the Mirelands. Roserade, however, needed to be stunned 10 times, which is about 10 to 15 mud balls for the first stun, and the subsequent ones only took about 5 or 6, so it took like 50, 60 mud balls and spoiled apricorns. This is really the same for all the other alphas that need to be stunned, like Torterra for example. And around the Roserade during the daytime, there are a ton of Roselia, and at night there's a ton of Murkrow around the Honchkrow. Now, we can't actually perfect Honchkrow unlike Roserade, because we need to catch Honchkrow while it's flying in the air, and the only one that's flying in the air that we can catch is in a later area, so this one is currently an incomplete one. Now, just south of that alpha spawn, there are 2 spots where either Sudowoodo or Bonsly will spawn. I thought these would be super tedious to complete, but it really wasn't all that bad, especially with the stealth sprays. For Bonsly specifically, you need to see it leap out of ore deposits. It spawns in ore deposits in the slower section near the Alpha Rhyhorn, and speaking of that Alpha Rhyhorn, this is the main one I ended up catching about 15 times at least, just so I could instantly evolve it to the dex entries required for catching Rhyhorn and Rhyperior, and although those are unable to be perfected at the moment, due to having entries we can't do, such as defeating them or stuff like that, we will be able to do that in a later area. Now, the final area within this little section of the Mirelands is the ruins. Within these ruins, you can find Ralts, Kirlia, Lickitung, and an Alpha Licky, though that's not the only Licky that we can find, but I'll get more into that towards the end of the Mirelands kind of section. Ralts and Kirlia specifically were really annoying, as these needed to be caught as small specimens, both of them. However, a small workaround was just evolving the small Ralts into Kirlia so they'd get those entries done too. But on top of that, I also needed to find and KO 15 more Kirlia, on top of also catching 10 without being spotted. It was a tedious entry, and it was one of the more time-consuming ones out of this entire area. I also only needed to catch 3 Alpha Licky, so that was a really easy entry to complete, since I could just evolve Lickitung or catch some of the other ones that I'll talk about later. Next, I want to talk about the kind of center area of the map. And I'll also talk about the left side in this bit, since it didn't have anything distinguishing or specific I needed to find there, so I'll just throw it in here. A quick overview on that is I only went to the left side when I was checking all the Ursaluna digging spots, which are indicated by the star markers I placed on my map. Aside from that, the only Pokemon that are found there can also be found in other locations like Krogunk or Pachirisu, and the occasional rare world spawn, and an Alpha Ursaring, of which there are actually 2 spawns for in the Mirelands. Now, getting back to the main focus, being the center portion of the map, we have some exclusive Pokemon here like Hippopotas, an Alpha Hippodon, Stunky, and an Alpha Stuntank, and a single spawn for an Onix, as well as an Alpha Onix spawn, which is necessary for the Dex entry, requiring me to catch 3 Alpha Steelix. And something important to note, it is actually possible to complete Steelix's Dex entry at this point, and that is something that I will be doing, but similar to the Leaky Tongue entry, more on that later. This section was actually really easy to get through, and I ended up running through here a ton for getting some moves that I needed to use for Dex entries done, like Mud Bomb with Whiscash, combining that with KOing the required amount of Stunky or Stuntank, since those both required to be knocked out a lot. Even for some of the more difficult entries like Ursaring, which required getting 40 KOs, or even Ursaluna, it was actually super easy because I started hunting for the digging spot super early on in this area, so by the time I was getting to Ursaluna's entry, I had more than enough P-blocks required, and I also had other ways of getting those KOs required for Ursaring, which, if you haven't guessed, I'll talk about later. Now, another portion of the map that had some exclusive Pokemon I needed was here at the bottom of the map, being the home of trials. I believe I said that right. But the main Pokemon here are 3 Alphas that are only here, Torterra, Toxicroak, and Sliggoo. Now, there are actually plenty of Toxicroak around the Alpha, but this is actually the only area they appear at the moment. And just like Ursaring, although I kind of glossed over Ursaring a bit, there are some tedious entry requirements for Toxicroak, that being scaring them with Scatterbangs, which we don't have access to the moment, or so I'd like to say. However, we now have access to the Ginkgo Guild, who just so happen to have a chance to sell you 10 Scatterbangs every time their shop refreshes, and their shop only refreshes after you catch 20 Pokemon, and since I don't want to have to refresh their inventory hundreds of times, I have to get the most bang for my buck, and use these Scatterbangs wisely since there are an array of Pokemon that need to be startled by them, both new and old entries. The old entries being Mr. Mime and Abra back in the Fieldlands, Golduck, Ursaring, Sudowoodo, Ghastly, Haunter, Krogunk, and Toxicroak all need this entry in the Mirelands. Now, what I did was I found about 2 to 3 of that specific Pokemon that I needed. I'd bait them together using berries as best I could, and then I'd use a single Scatterbang to get about 2 to 3 startled per single Scatterbang, and even then, that's still up to 3 Scatterbangs per Pokemon entry, of which there are 9, and Haunter required to be startled about 7 times. But since it spawns more plentifully, I managed to get a bunch of them around, and I finished it in about the same amount of Scatterbangs as I would with any of the other Pokemon. In total, it still took me about 22 or 23 Scatterbangs, but I got pretty lucky on the Ginkgo Guild selling them to me, so it wasn't actually too bad of an entry. Sliggoo and Torterra were also pretty easy though. They just required to be rezoning in and out a lot, and the Mirelands in general wasn't too bad with this because I just combined all the alphas together and had my own kind of route I would do. And on top of that, very similar to the Rhyhorn, with Sliggoo I caught a bunch of the alphas since they're already level 50, and I just waited till it rained to spam evolve all of them into Goodra for the entry required for that. It was super easy, and I was not gonna just catch a bunch of Goomy and then raise them 20 levels each to get them into Goodra. The alpha is the much easier route. Now, the last section of the Mirelands I want to talk about is the right side of the map, which contains the only spawn locations for Petilil, Togepi, Togetic, kinda, Turtwig, Grotle, Yanma, Alpha Yanmega, and an Alpha Vespiquen, which can only be found in trees around here very rarely. Now, a fun quick story, before I lost all my Pokemon save data, which led to this video being made, I actually found a shiny Alpha Vespiquen. Not in the alpha spawn, I got it from a tree, which is insane because that's a 1% chance for it to be an alpha, which only occurs after you beat the noble within an area, and a 1 in 585 chance to be shiny, since I had perfect entry and shiny charm on all Pokemon in that save file. Anyways, within the trees around the Petilil and Alpha Vespiquen, there's a 25% chance for it to be a Vespiquen, and only in those trees. Most other trees on the right side of the map also had Pachirisu, which we needed to see 25 jump out of trees there. So it took a while, but it really wasn't that tedious for that one. I just made sure to check every single tree I could. Petilil and Togepi also have nearby spawns to each other in the meadows, so those could be done around the same time. And getting the entry for Sleeping Togepi was a nightmare because of how awful the hitboxes for a lot of the Pokeballs are, especially on smaller Pokemon and even on some of the unknown, which I'll briefly talk about in a bit. But the Pokeball hitboxes are awful, and I hope Legends ZA fixes it. I really do. Anyways, the only other Pokemon noteworthy here was Turtwig and Grotle in the very south portion of the map here across the little pond. They only spawn here, and from my experience, Turtwig was like a guaranteed spawn, and Grotle was a low chance, but I got pretty lucky with it. We only needed to see one so we could feed it berries, and then we could just evolve the rest of the Turtwig we caught for the Grotle entries. And quickly before we get to the end of this portion of the Pokédex, the unknown are pretty simple to do. At the moment, you can only catch 12 in this point of the game, 5 in the Mirelands, 3 in Jubilife, and 4 in the Fieldlands, since there's one that we actually can't reach in Lake Verity in the Fieldlands. Now, onto this actual final portion of the Mirelands Dex, we have Space-Time Distortions. As of unlocking the Mirelands, we gain access to these, and we have plenty of rare items we can get from these, like Evolution Stones, of which we can farm 4 more Ice Stones for Glaceon, 10 Daw Stones for Gallade, and I actually bought a few using merit points, since while waiting for Distortions I was also getting Satchels to spawn. We also need just 3 upgrades for Porygon, which can be found in Distortions in the Mireland. The reason for only needing the upgrades is because both Porygon and Porygon 2 require being evolved for their entries, but evolving Porygon into Porygon 2 counts for both of their entries, so I can just catch Porygon Z later in the Distortions. We're going to be farming them a lot, so I'm not too worried about the chance of getting these. And the other Pokemon that spawn in these Distortions also spawn in the Fieldlands, so they're old Pokemon that we don't need to do anything for, so Porygon is the only new entry that we have to get done. However, we also unlocked Distortions in the Fieldlands, and I am so glad we did, because my luck was phenomenal. In the Fieldlands Distortions, we can get Gengar and Steelix, which by defeating the 10 Steelix in here, we can complete that Dex entry, and we can just catch 5 Gengar and perfect that entry pretty easily as well. Ursaring and Licky Licky can also be found here, which is how I was able to speed up progress on those entries for catching and KOing them, along with scaring Ursaring with Scatterbangs, because this is the only way to get more than one Ursaring to spawn at this point of the game. In the Fieldlands, Sneasel is the rare or main spawn of the Distortions, specifically Jotonian Sneasel, which makes it even cooler that this happened.
That's insane!
I found a shiny Jotonian Sneasel in Legends Arceus with no Shining Charm, and on top of that, I also ended up getting a shiny Eevee in a Distortion, and a shiny Floatzel in one. I believe the Floatzel was in the Crimson Mirelands, so that one wasn't in the Fieldlands, but I figured I'd mention anyways, because Distortion shinies are really cool. I haven't really been bringing up any of the shinies, but Distortion shinies are just so cool that I really wish they got like a special ribbon if I transferred them to another game, like the Time Traveler as a title would have been so sick. But anyways, by just hiding in the grass and throwing food, I was able to complete the entry of making it eat, and I also had to catch 25 of them, which is a minimum of 9 Distortions, and from all those, I got more than enough Razor Claws for the Sneasels to evolve them into Weaviles, and get Weavile's entry perfected as well. Now, we couldn't actually perfect Sneasel entry, since we needed to catch a male and female version of the Hisuian form, which we can't do at the moment. Now, with all that completed, our entries go from 56 out of 84 perfected entries, all the way up to 109 out of 141, thus nearly reaching the halfway mark in perfected entries, being just about 12 off, and passing the halfway point in Pokemon caught. So now we can head on to the next area, that being the Cobalt Coastlands. Since we've completed over half the decks, and there are about 10 or so legendaries that are stuck to the post-game, these next few sections are going to be a good bit shorter, and just have less Pokemon within them in general. So now that we're in the Coastlands, we unlock Basculegion, and in doing so, we can finally go back to the Fieldlands and complete Infernape's Dex entry, as we can reach Raminas Island now. In addition to that, there are a few Dex entries to complete due to quests or other things, which I'll talk about when we get to them, but the quest ones specifically include Eevee, Combee, and Krogunk. As for the additional Pokemon we can now perfect, we can catch Honchkrow flying in the air at night near Apom Hill. We can finally get the final Burmy and Wormadam forms as we get the Sandy Cloaks and Mirelands, and now we can get the Trash Cloaks. Gyarados can also now be found in the water in the Coastlands, so we can finish the KOs on it that we needed and complete its entry. Togetic also has a single spawn location that we can KO it for its one entry. This one required a lot of rezoning in and out, but since it was only one KO, it wasn't as bad as I'd expected it to be. And we can also catch the last 2 required forms for Shellos and Gastrodon to perfect their entries. The last 2 Pokemon we can complete are within these Space-Time Distortions once again, those being Rhyhorn and Rhyperior, who spawn randomly within these distortions, so I can just KO them and stun them to finish their Dex entries, and since this is the only location that we can find them at the moment, we have to do it all within this area, because the Alpha Rhyperior spawns only in the Highlands, so we can't rely on that at all. While we're on the topic of distortions, the new main Pokemon within these distortions is a little bit of a hassle considering it's Magnemite, and its requirements are a little brutal. We need to catch 15, 5 of those being light specimens, which thankfully I managed to get really quickly, and we also have to defeat 15, 10 of which have to be with ground moves, so if we goof up and we don't have any ground moves in any Pokemon, there's a chance that we'll have to KO even more than 15. Aside from that, Magneton's really simple, just requiring 10 to be caught, which can be done by evolving already caught Magnemite, and then I just have to use Spark, Tri-Attack, and 25 Agile moves. And the evolution requirements for Magnemite and Magneton, once again, just like Porygon, can be done together. as evolving Magnemite into Magneton will count for both entries. Magnezone is a little more tricky because we can't actually perfect it yet, as you need to catch it while it's flying in the air, and we can't do that within these distortions at all. Instead, we need to wait until we get to the Highlands. Aside from that, we just need to get 15, which can be done with good luck just catching them in distortions, or just evolving Magneton using Thunderstones. And due to the first section of the video, I have zero issues with needing any more Thunder, Fire, or Water Stones. Next, I just want to talk about the Pokemon within small sections of the map. Once again, starting with the southern strip of land, within this area, the new Pokemon we can find are the entire Duskull line at night, including an Alpha Dusknoir, which means we can perfect that entire evolutionary line, and we can also find Chatot around here in the daytime, which is really easy to complete. And within the water around this area, there are Remoraid's, which once again is pretty easy to complete. Just more to the left of that, there's Apom Hill, and the Hideaway Bay, which obviously have Apom, but also an Alpha Ambipom and some Spheal and Celio spawns. One annoying task is the Apoms in trees, since it once again is the Cherubi tree task again, but there's a little bit of an exploit to make it potentially still take longer, but make it more consistent. If you get a Pokemon within a tree or an ore deposit, and you defeat or catch it or whatever the case, you can enter a cave similar to this. Each zone has one as long as you're in the post game, but the Coastlands is the first one that we've been able to reach the cave, and the first one we're able to access since the lake caves and the Fieldlands, Mirelands are all currently closed off and inaccessible until like the end game. But back to the method I'm talking about, you basically just enter the cave and just wait 30 minutes. Austin John has a video on it, but he talks about using it for duplicating shinies and all that. I'm instead just doing it for Monkey. I'll leave a link to the video in the description or something like that, but yeah. I didn't do this for all the entries, I just did it for the occasional one or two when I was doing something else. In the more central part of the map, by the first camp, you can find an Alpha Walrein by the shore, and by jumping up the slope to the right of the camp, there's an upper cliff where you can also find some Glameow and Purugly, in addition to the Alpha Purugly that's on Veilstone Cape. And additionally, on that cape, there's some Growlithe and Vulpix spawns. However, some more guaranteed Growlithe spawns are up on the cliff to the Windbreak Stand, which can be easily accessed by climbing up a small little rock cliff with Weirdair. Also, we can't perfect Vulpix at the moment, since we can't complete its X entry until we get the Alolan Vulpix questline. This also gives some better access to the Isle Spy Shore and Spring Path, of which we can catch Alpha Empoleon and do its entries, along with finding Piplup and Primplup spawning by this little pond, where I also took a picture of a Bibarel years ago when PLA first came out, so yeah. Look at him! The next and final landmass is the Fire Spit Island, which has Magmar and Magby. There's no Alpha Ninetales until after we defeat the Noble, which obviously we can't do until we perfect the Dex as much as possible in this location. Now, the actual last area I want to cover is just the entirety of the water. I've already talked about Remoraid, but it's pretty much just found around like any of the shorelines for like the main landmass. And the other Pokemon in the water really just consist of Tentacool and Tentacruel, both of which are really simple to complete, just catching a bunch. And the Alpha Tentacruel, which needs to be caught 3 times and KO a bunch of them with electric moves. And that's actually the case for a lot of these water-type Pokemon, like Gyarados or Lumineon needing to be KO'd by electric moves. Either that, or grass moves in the case of Remoraid, or the next Pokemon I'm going to talk about, Finneon. And for both Finneon and Lumineon, I need to catch them at night. However, I just caught a bunch of Finneon at night and evolved those into Lumineon at night for that requirement. And in addition to that, I also just farmed the Alpha spawn to Lumineon for its entries since it was the most consistent way to get it done. Another Alpha Pokemon we need to farm is the Alpha Mantine, which we just need to catch 7 times for the large specimen requirement, and I need to catch an absurd amount of Mantike for the small specimen requirement, since they all looked really small, but half the ones I caught just weren't actually small. I was just getting really unlucky, I guess. But aside from that, they spawn pretty plentifully around the Tranquility Cove, so it wasn't too much of a hassle, it was just time consuming. And the last Pokemon in the water is Basculin. We only need to catch 15, but the biggest issue is needing 7 large specimen, which I assume was intended for you to catch the Alpha one in the Highlands. I'm pretty sure there was an Alpha in the Highlands. I honestly might be entirely wrong, but with no access to that anyways, there's really not as many Basculin spawns either, so it seemed like it'd be a lot more tedious. I got pretty lucky with the large specimens, so it wasn't all too bad. It was just a little time consuming, but not nearly as much as the Mantike. Additionally, we can also perfect its evolution pretty easy, since we just have to take recoil damage and not faint while using Basculin in order to evolve it into Basculegion, and I believe it's something like 300 damage without fainting at all, or something around those lines. The easiest way to get all the evolutions was just getting a Basculin, using Wave Crash on the Geodude and Magmar in the Fire Spit Island, and then just healing them up with berries, and then just repeating that repeatedly. It was a really easy task to complete. With all those Pokemon done, we've completed the Cobalt Coastlands, and that brings the turtle all the way up to 178 Pokemon caught, and roughly 154 out of 178 Pokemon perfected. Truthfully, I don't remember the exact number as I'm writing this portion of the script while finishing up a later part of the map, and normally we'd move on to the Coronet Highlands directly, but first we can finally knock out some more entries for Ninetales since it now spawns as an alpha after defeating the Noble in the Coastlands. So I figured I'd just add that into this section since it's technically being done in the Coastlands, but it should be part of the next. It doesn't matter. You get the point. Now that we're moving on to the Coronet Highlands, we can finish up a few entries that we started in different areas, such as Golem, which spawns as an alpha in the Stonetooth Rose, Gudra, who also spawns as an alpha in the Ancient Quarry, Heracross, who can be found in trees for its last research requirement, Magnezone, who can be found flying in the sky in different parts of the map, in one case being just impossible for me to catch for some reason. I honestly still have no idea what was going on here. And the final entry we can complete is Sneasel, who we can catch a male and female Hisuian form of. In terms of the amount of new Pokemon we have to complete, this one has only around 30 entries we can complete or partially complete. And to start off, we have the Distortion Pokemon, which are not as bad as you'd think, considering there's only 2 brand new ones, as opposed to the usual single Pokemon with multiple evolutions. This one, however, only has 1 evolution for each brand new Pokemon, so it's technically 4, but it's nowhere near that bad. Those 2 being Cranidos and Shieldon, and I just needed to catch 10 of each and 7 heavy ones, which I got really lucky with only having to catch 10 Cranidos. However, in the time it took me to get just 10 Cranidos, I got nearly double that in Shieldon, and I just evolved a bunch of both of them in order to complete their evolution entries. The move requirements were also really simple, so it once again wasn't that bad. Rampardos was the most tedious of the fossils because you required 2 recoil moves, one of which only being 80% accurate, but even so, I just went to my hunting grounds and lowered the moth and butterfly populations significantly. Next, there were 2 Pokemon I had to find out of ores, those being Nosepass and Bronzor, which was honestly kind of annoying since it required 15 of each, along with the previously mentioned Heracross trees. However, after getting a decent understanding of the spawn locations, it wasn't all too bad, with Bronzor being often found in the Alpha Bronzong and around the same location as the Heracross trees in the Wayward Cave kinda exit area. Nosepass, however, was a little more tedious, and it was most commonly found near the Alpha Luxray spawn and in the higher ore locations on the cliffs surrounding the Alpha Gliscor, and along that path it leads to the Alpha Probopass, both of which were pretty easy to complete due to being static alpha spawns. Gligar was also incredibly easy due to the sheer amount of spawns it had. It actually completed its entire entry in a single run through. And there's also a new group of Pokemon I can talk about, those being Manaphy and Phione. Now, these aren't actually required in order to catch Arceus, but since they're obtainable at the moment, we're just going to do the quest line anyways and perfect their entries as well. We gained access to those 2 after beating the Noble in the Coastlands, and we can start the quest from the quest board, and then by putting an Overquill, Weasel, and Mantic into my party, and riding to the Stone Arches during the evening, we can head to its cave and peacefully subdue them, and then we work around their entries by just using a bunch of different attacks and agile and strong styles. It wasn't really all that bad, and for any non-damaging moves, once again, went back to the Magikarps. However, there's actually a new group of Magikarps in the Coastlands that we can use. Down by the Fabled Spring, we can encounter Clefairy and its evolutionary line during the nighttime, including an Alpha Clefable, which we need to catch a few times. Although with all the Moonstones from previous distortions and all that, it's also pretty easy to just evolve a bunch of Clefairy I caught. The real problem was Cleffa, who I got insanely lucky with since it's such a rare spawn, and I got an outbreak for it. However, funny enough, by that point I had already caught almost the entire required amount, so it came a little bit later than I needed it to, but I'm not complaining, it sped it up a little bit more than it would have been. And since it was nighttime whenever I came down here, I also ran into the Alphas, Magus, and in turn all the Mischievous around it on the route down there, and we were able to complete their entries pretty easily, honestly. You can also find Rotom in those areas, so we were able to do those as well. There's only a few evolutionary lines I need to talk about, mainly like the Electabuzz line, for example, which was also pretty easy since they all spawn on the path above the plaza, including a static Alpha Electivire, and I got lucky again with an outbreak for Elekid, which actually contained a shiny one, which was pretty cool. The Electabuzz line also overlapped with the Gible line for me, since I used Garchomp to get all the required KOs, to get some of the required 100 strong style moves knocked off the list. However, even so, it just wasn't enough, and I still had to get 4 Garchomp, teach them all False Swipe, and then just spam strong style False Swipe on Magikarp, with each Garchomp getting about 15 strong styles off before I swapped to the next, which totaled about 60 strong styles off of just False Swipes. And for the rest of the Gible line, I just caught and KO'd the Alpha Gabite and all the Gible spawns around it for its entry. Getting a bunch of Garchomp was also pretty easy since the Alpha Gabite could evolve right away after being caught. However, we'd be unable to perfect Garchomp since it has no spawns for us to KO in the Highlands. The same goes for Togekiss, Machamp, Crobat, Gardevoir, and Gallade still. The last few Pokemon species I need to cover are Sneasler, which was done easily since I had a bunch of Razorclaws from the original Sneasler that I caught in the distortions in the Fieldlands, Voltorb, who can be found with at least 3 spawns in the Sacred Plaza, Electrode being tedious, but I just ran with a team of 5 of them, and I used all the recoil moves within the Coastlands before I'd heal and then repeat, and for the styles of moves I needed to use, I just used Thunder Wave on Magikarp, like usual. I did the same for Rotom, and I was able to buy all the appliance from the Ginkgo Guild every time I went in and out of the Highlands. It was a kind of a passive thing I did in the background. The actual last 2 Pokemon being Chimecho, who can't be completed since I needed to catch 3 alphas, and that's impossible since there's no random alphas yet until after you defeat the Noble in an area. Chingling also has a bunch of spawns around the Alpha Rhyperior, which I was able to farm pretty easily and caught a bunch of during an outbreak as well. And that's all for the Pokemon in this area, and as such, let's go over the numbers quickly. Once again, I forgot to double check these, so they may be a little inaccurate before we move on to the next location, but we ended off with 206 Pokemon caught, and roughly 187 out of 206 perfected entries. So now we can move on to the final area of the game, however don't mistake that for meaning the final section of the challenge, or even the video. Now that we're in the Alabaster Icelands, there's one thing I want to say, and it's that this is the small section of the map that we have to finish in terms of quantity of Pokemon, and on top of that, there are still 3 non-legendary Pokemon that we can't perfect at this point. Those Pokemon being Togekiss, who's actually impossible until the post-game, and Zoroark and Avalugg, and that's just due to how the encounter tables work. Normally you'd be able to find them roaming around where their lower evolution variants spawn, however that only happens after you defeat the Noble, since once the Noble in the location is defeated, the encounter tables open up allowing alpha variants of the Pokemon to spawn, and in addition to that, the higher evolution of those Pokemon, such as Golbat spawning in the Fieldlands normally after you defeat Cleaver, whereas prior to that, there was only the single alpha spawn of Golbat in the Fieldlands. Now, since we've gotten that information out of the way, I started this final area by finishing up some past entries, such as obtaining the Alolan Vulpix, and evolving it to finish the evolutionary line. And a few new alphas we can farm and to finish up some entries are Machamp, Garchomp, Gardevoir, Gallade, Chimecho, and in addition to those alphas, we can also catch the Flying Crobat for its entry next to the Alpha Lucario spawn. We can also complete the quest for Blissey and perfect its entry finally, which was the only requirement we still needed from the very beginning of the game, aside from a Pokemon I almost forgot, which was the Sleeping Snorlax requirement. And speaking of flying Pokemon, Braviary is another Pokemon we have to catch in the sky, which I did while working on Gallade's dex entries for the catching an alpha requirement and defeating them with ghost type moves. The Braviary can only be caught from the top of the temple, so it was genuinely kind of tedious, and I didn't plan on getting all of its catch requirements this way. Thankfully, however, in the lake atop the mountain, there are some high-level Rufflet which can be immediately evolved as soon as you catch them, which made this entry a whole lot easier. For a majority of the entries, there wasn't really anything special that I did. I was just running around catching a ton of Pokemon using stealth sprays, which made the entries that required not being spotted much easier. There were some tedious entries, however, such as a few Pokemon that required using Blizzard, such as Avalugg, Abomasnow, and Mamoswine. However, thanks to the fact that this is a snow area, we can get 100% accurate Blizzards when it snows. Unlike we had with Walrein in the Coastlands, a lot of Pokemon also had requirements like using strong style moves or agile style moves upwards of 70 times, and for all of them I just did the Magikarp method, except for Abomasnow. Abomasnow had 0 non-damaging moves, so I filled my party with a few and just spammed every move that he had required in the strong style. It took a while, but nowhere near as bad as you'd expect. The only other Pokemon required 70 moves were Mamoswine and Lucario. For Lucario, I just used Agile Style Aura Sphere the entire time and beat up everything I saw in the Icelands. I also just farmed the Alpha and the natural spawn sword around it, along with Riolu in the valley that are below that Alpha. And the only other noteworthy entry I can think of that's worth mentioning really is Bergmite being found in ore deposits, but I got pretty lucky on those, and it was pretty quick to check through them since we had Braviary now. Don't know how, but I almost completely forgot to add in Spiritomb and Unknown. Up to this point, these were unable to be perfected since Unknown's entries are all just about catching every letter, which are spread throughout all 5 regions and Jubilife, so we needed to get access to all the regions. And the same goes for Spiritomb's Wisps, which I've been collecting in the background of doing all these tasks. With those 2 covered, we're at a total of 220 Pokemon caught, and 217 Pokemon perfected, with those last 3 being those that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. Now you may notice the 222 in the top left, and that's just because it's counting the 2 starters being in my Pokédex from the tutorial of the game, so yeah. Anyways, on to the next section. Now, we're in what's really the smallest amount of Pokemon in a section, the pre-post game. Within this small section, we're able to finally find Avalugg spawning around Avalugg's Legacy, and you should be able to find Zoroark where Zoro spawns, but I could not find it for the life of me. A single one, I just couldn't find one. So I continued the story, and I ended up noticing how far back Kamado stands from his Pokemon, and that his face follows your player's movements, It was a really small thing, but it was something funny I noticed. Anyways, we can now catch Dialga, and I accidentally KO'd it the first time around. I didn't realize there was also an additional kind of dialogue and cutscene for that scenario. But after catching it, I decided I should teach it some non-damaging moves so I could do the strong and agile style moves easier. And while on the way to do that, I got an idea. Ingo is here, and he can call people for me to battle, including Zissou, who just so happens to have a Zoroark on her team that I can farm for dex entries, and I felt like a genius. So I comboed that with using Dialga for some of its entries, and after completing Dialga's entry, I returned to rezoning to the Icelands to try and find a Zoroark again, so I could stun it 10 times just to finish perfecting its entry. Shockingly, I found an Alpha Zorua before that. Fun fact, Zoroark is supposed to have a 4.67% encounter here. Alphas are a 0.9% chance to spawn. But after a very long time, I finally found a Zoroark. And with all that done, we can now complete the main story by beating Palkia, which was very easy, and I beat it while only being hit once because I was being a bit too greedy, so I took damage that I didn't really need to. But now with this done, we have roughly 224 Pokemon perfected out of 225, and we can now move on to the actual post-game. Heading into the post-game, we now have Palkia, and we continue the story up to where Kogita tells us about a bunch of the legendaries we can obtain, and to prevent you from getting too bored on the details, I'll just go over the Pokemon we can catch. But before that, we can obtain the quest from the quest board to get Shaman and Darkrai, since I do have save data for both Sword and Shield and BDSP. And in addition to that, we can talk to Laventon and get the last two starters we didn't pick, though we can also catch them in a bunch of mass outbreaks now. Back into the legendaries in the main story, we can catch Mesprit, Uxie, Azelf, Heatran, Cresselia, and Regigigas. After obtaining all the plates, we can continue to the final plate and battle Volo. This battle is normally extremely difficult, but considering most of my team is level 90 to 100, since I've had them for hundreds of hours now, it really isn't all too bad, and we can beat him in order to, funnily enough, finally complete Togekiss' dex entry, which required me to defeat only one, and this is the only one you can naturally battle. I assume you can battle them in mass outbreaks as well, but that's a little more RNG dependent, and that didn't get added until later in this game's life cycle, but that's beside the point. With Volo out of the way, we gain access to Giratina, and also the last four Pokemon, the Forces of Natures, or some people like to call them the Weather Genies. These Pokemon are honestly a little annoying because of the way their shields work with hitting them, but once you get that down, you can just go into a battle with them and then catch them a lot easier that way. Now we have to complete the entries for the original three genies before we can catch an Amorous. We don't have to perfect them, but we do have to get them to Research 10 in order to get access to an Amorous. When it comes to completing their entries, however, the Forces of Nature seem really annoying since you have to use the signature move, which isn't a guaranteed accuracy move. However, they are 100% accurate during storms, of which we can guarantee during MMOs, and that makes them much easier. Same goes, of course, for an Amorous. I actually transferred in some shiny versions of some Pokemon like the Lake Spirits from Oras that I caught last year, and I decided to use those because why not? I already caught them in this game, and it doesn't really change much. Azelf was really the only tedious of these since it had to use self-destruct, but I could just spam citrus berries after each use, and it made it a lot less tedious to do. Aside from that, all the Pokemon were pretty straightforward and didn't require much dialogue from me, so let's just get into the finale. The last Pokemon was Arceus, and it actually took me 2 attempts. Now, I didn't really talk a whole lot through the boss fight, so instead I'll just play the fight in the background while I'm explaining my reasons for doing this, along with some additional info about what I'll be doing with this channel moving forwards. My reason for doing this is that my Switch broke a while ago. It kind of just had an issue with the battery that short-circuited it a bit, and I already had a perfect deck save file and even some of the event cosmetics, which are really cool, but I ended up losing hundreds of shinies and all of my Pokemon save data for every Switch game. So I wanted to have some sort of connection with this playthrough, so it'd feel just as special as my first playthrough. So that's pretty much just the only reason I did this. I figured I'd make a video out of it anyways. But thank you all for watching to the end of the video. I started working on this video around February 7th of this year, and it's taken me a long time to get it done. It took me about 16 or 17 days to finish, and by days I mean entirely in playtime. It took 404 hours, and a lot of that came from space-time distortions and satchels, but even so, this still would have easily taken around 300 hours regardless. Now, as for the kind of content you'll find here, it's gonna be a bit more random. My main channel is primarily funny moments that I spend a lot of time editing, specifically on a game called Predecessor, but I do occasionally do other games on there, so check that channel out if you're interested, it'll be linked in the description. Also, I will do the occasional funny moments video here. It'll just be less edited and be less mainstream games and just stuff like that. What I really want is this channel to just be where I can create videos that I want to without worrying about my algorithm and stuff. I plan to really just upload whenever I have a video ready, as opposed to having like a weekly upload schedule like I do on my main channel, so don't expect anything too consistent here. This is kind of just, I guess, a passion project, which my main channel started out as, but yeah, I kind of just want this to be where I post anything I wouldn't on my main. With all that said, let me know what you all thought of the video, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Have a great day. Adios.